Друзья, коллеги, доброе утро, добрый
Colleagues,
день.
friends, hello everyone. We are happy to welcome you to our so far online uh, meeting of CGI Russia. This is a part of the global system of the initiative created by the World Economic CGI initiative. I'm happy to see a lot of familiar faces. I know that many of you already know what we do, how we've been developing, how we've been engaging with corporate secretaries and heads of ESG subdivisions, and also everyone who is interested in ESG and in particular the climate risk management and climate agenda. Please note that today's discussion and the video recordings of our today's session will be available.
Если вдруг у вас есть с этим какие-то проблемы, то вы, пожалуйста, напишите в наш
If
общий чат.
anyone has a problem with that, please write us about it in the chat and we will try to adjust. But generally, that's the rule of thumb to do the video recording. That's why I'm drawing your attention to this. The discussion will be available both in Russian and in English. We have simultaneous interpretation available. The speakers can select the language that is most convenient for them and select the channel in Russian or in English.
Синхронный перевод, и вы
We have
можете
simultaneous interpreters on board, and you can switch between the two channels, English and Russian. I am currently in the channel for the Russian language. Our moderators will be working in Russian. A very interesting topic today. We're going to talk about the role of the banking sector in efforts to reduce impact on climate and transitioning to low carbon economy. Of course, we are going to primarily talk about Russia, but we also have international expertise, and we're going to share that international expertise with you. Today, we will talk about how the banking agenda is related to climate change and ESG. This includes several streams: risk management, financing, and direct involvement in M&A transactions. We'll also talk about how banks acting as lenders, investors, advisors, and one of the main links in the supply chain can directly impact on commercial or other activities of different companies in the context of managing climate risks and in the context of climate change issues. We'll also talk about the regulatory framework and the position of the central bank in the climate agenda and environmental protection, and we will maybe touch upon forecasts for 2021 and maybe even 2022. Recent studies show that approximately 7% of Russian banks are already using, to a certain extent, ESG principles, be it with an emphasis on the climate agenda or not, in their activities, in their work. But there is this spooky number. About 80% of the banks are still waiting for some regulatory directives. We know, though, that financial institutions are sort of integral blood vessels, integral components in the circulation system of the economy of the finance system, and they are drivers, along with regulators, they are drivers of big and also small changes that are so necessary in this period of global transition, global shift. We've been increasingly more often been hearing about ESG banks. An ESG bank is about green, responsible, transformative banking. That is basically a set of principles that help us move from speculative banking towards a healthier alternative. And we've been observing this big transition in the banking industry, and we hope that this will only be gaining momentum. 2020, 2019, 2020 were those debut years where in 2020, 2021, we've seen 9 new issues of green bonds, bonds issued taking into account the green principles, also the Moscow Exchange, WebRF. So we see that this is gaining traction. At the same time, we see that a sustainable effect of the so-called greenium, where investors are ready to pay a premium along green securities as opposed to regular ones. This is still somewhat new. Still, we are happy to see that there is a discussion ongoing, and we're happy to see that so many wonderful speakers are engaged in it. We expect a very interesting and productive discussion. Once again, I remind you that we have been closely working with our partners. For almost a year, they have been helping us in so many ways. This is our title partner, Sberbank, our main strategic partner, PowerPolis. We also work with Deloitte, Permit Hales and Knowlton, Exerica. Our hosting partner is the Club of Independent Directors of the Skolkovo Business School, and also we've been working with London Stock Exchange. We're happy to see that the network of our partners have been developing. We've been building stronger ties, more useful relations, and we continue working on high quality content for you. Our speakers, Tatiana Zavyalova, Senior Vice President of Sberbank, Andrei Yakushin, Head of Corporate Relations Department, Bank of Russia, Regina von Fleming, member of the Supervisory Board, Sovcombank, Ekaterina Trofimova, Risk Advisory Department and Leader, Financial Services Industry, Deloitte, CIS, and Mikhail Chaikin, CEO, ING Bank Eurasia. We also have Francesca Tondigai on board. She is the member of the Board of Directors and the chair of the ESG Committee of UniCredit Italy. I give the floor to Olga Pastor, my colleague from CGI Russia. Let's begin. Thank you very much, Elena. From the onset, I'd like to say that as someone who has spent more than 20 years working in the banking sector and someone who has participated in the transformation of the industry and is now on the board of directors in one of the major banks in the CIS region, I have to say that today's topic is highly relevant, highly topical, and very close to my heart. To build on what Elena said, I wanted to add that preparing for the Glasgow conference in November this year, at the international arena of the banking sector, we see a very clear trend toward collaboration. Banks have been striving to work out a unified, shared approach to analyzing, assessing, and implementing a strategy that would lead to decarbonizing not just financial institutions, but also their customers and the entire supply chain. In April 2021, the Net Zero Banking Alliance was created, bringing together 43 banks from 23 countries with assets amounting to 28.5 trillion US dollars. The Alliance participants, the Alliance members, have a goal to have their credit and investment portfolios carbon neutral by 2025. So far, they have intermediary goals until 2023. We have a brilliant example of Pioneer Bank that has recently joined this alliance. This is one of the leading global banks. In October 2020, HSBC announced its climate strategy and said that by 2050, its customers and its entire supply chain will achieve net zero. The HSBC strategy is as follows. First, supporting their customers in transitioning to carbon neutrality. Namely, HSBC plans to provide by 2030 up to $1 trillion US dollars as sustainable financing and investment to support their customers in going more sustainable, more carbon neutral. The second aspect of their strategy focuses on the climate solution and supporting innovations. HSBC underscores that going carbon neutral requires brand new solutions. The bank is somewhat of a trailblazer in financing new technology and environmentally protective projects. The third component is reinventing HSBC as a net zero bank. To do that, they want to achieve zero emissions in their operations and the supply chain by 2030. Second, they plan to use the Paris Agreement tools to assess the capital transition in order to develop clear-cut approaches to achieve these goals. Third is engagement with other banks and other industries, other industry organizations, as well as central banks. And the fourth component is regular and transparent disclosure about their strategy and disclosing financial information related to climate goals. In addition to that, HSBC includes climate risks in the matrix for assessing its own external risks and risks for their customers. It all looks perfect. What could go wrong? In January 2021, however, just several months after they announced their strategy, the group that represents $2.4 trillion asset portfolio said that they suspect HSBC of greenwashing because the bank continues to finance loss-giving projects, coal projects, despite the announcement that they would like to be carbon neutral. Almond Group and some other large investors doubted the seriousness of HSBC intentions. These investors, as well as 15 other organizations, supported a resolution that forced the bank to disclose very specifically how they de-invest carbon emission projects, coal projects. HSBC has announced the plan to stop lending to companies that use fossil fuel. 60 major commercial banks, let me remind you, have invested almost $4 trillion in fossil fuel-related projects since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. So decarbonizing the economy is a global challenge. And if we want to not just announce our goals, but demonstrate concrete results, members of the boards of directors of major banks should work together. Experience exchange is a key factor in this transformation process, which is why the global initiative of the WEF, which we are part of, has just created a center for members of the boards. And today we have the head of admin of the ESG committee of UniCredit Bank, Francesca Tondi.
Thank you very much, Olga, and good morning to everyone. And I'm sorry that I have to do this in English. I do not speak Russian, but thank you for just allowing me today to say a couple of words about a new initiative we are launching as part of Chapter Zero Global. So it's a specific hub and module on climate change for the financial sector with a global approach. I think as directors of larger financial institutions, we're all conscious that the regulatory landscape on climate change for the financial sector is complex and evolving rapidly. And I think our responsibility and liability as directors on this matter is ever increasing. But not only that, climate change is not even just about managing risk. I think it is also about the opportunity that the financial sector has to participate and be a positive catalyst in a transition to a low carbon economy for both our clients and the societies that we operate in. However, what I find and what we find as also talking to many colleagues in the industry is that the knowledge and understanding that the financial sector, that the board on this complex matter have is still, in the financial still a direct topic to just of these specific issues and complexity that the financial sector is facing on climate change. Under the Chapter Zero global umbrella, we are developing a sector-specific hub to help directors build the knowledge they require and promote the debate in the boardroom on a global basis. So what we want is we aim to run regular sector-specific webinars and workshops and provide a forum for directors to debate what is a global issue that affects us all in the boardroom. So the first webinar we aim to run in July. And there'll be others to follow. We'll send a series of events. We're hoping to send invitations soon, which we'll do through the various countries' initiatives or Chapter Zero and on the climate change initiative. So stay tuned, and we're hoping to make these, as I said, a forum where we can all learn, share experiences, connect with each other on a global basis, but on a very financial sector specific basis too. So Olga, thank you so much. It is all I wanted to say today. And I very much appreciated this opportunity to flag this initiative. Over to you.
Спасибо, Франческа. Со своей стороны хочу подчеркнуть, что создание...
Thank you, Francesca. And I also would like to say that creating this platform, this center, Independent Center for Financial Directors, is a great example of collaboration and a great step forward toward achieving global carbon neutrality. CGI Russia will, of course, actively participate in this initiative. And now, with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, whom you probably know very well. Ekaterina Trofimova has more than 20 years of experience under her belt working in the financial sector and is a witness of the banking sector transformation, both in Russia and the CIS region, and also abroad. So I'm sure she has plenty of fascinating insights to share. It would be great to hear from her about her take on how the ESG strategy will impact corporate governance in Russia and the CIS countries. Ekaterina, over to you. Olga, thank you very much. On behalf of Deloitte, which is a partner of this initiative, I would like to welcome everyone engaged in this discussion. I think it is extremely important to be talking about ESG in the banking sector, since banks are the blood circulation system of the entire organism of a country. And the activities of the banks have a direct impact on the success of the ESG agenda, ESG activities, and further economic development, including economic modernization. Next slide, please. We have prepared a small deck. I am currently a partner at Deloitte, working with financials. Over my years of experience in different roles, I have observed, I have participated directly in the development of the banking sector in CIS countries. And I'd like to say that the ESG topics, the ESG agenda, and the issues of working with this climate agenda have been a very important component in developing the banking sector, not just in the world, and also in Russia and CIS countries.
So on the next slide, we present the main drivers of this agenda. Deloitte see that the Russian banks and the banks in the CIS are just making their first steps. But objectively, we must say that all ESG elements are not evenly developed. The one lagging behind in the climate agenda, eco risks, but corporate governance, especially in connection with the regulators, in general, at least in form, conform to the world's best practices. So right now, we can mostly talk about evening out these parts of ESG. In reality, banks in the CIS and in Russia are making their first steps, so it's quite a new point of the agenda. And Deloitte, as one of the best consultants in this area, we're sometimes getting just the basic requests, what to do with this, what is ESG banking in general. So I must underline that it's even in the world's global practice, it's not yet completely determined. So when the new trends are formed, when the new notions are formed, this work actually is a good contribution into the formation of the further culture of the functioning of financial institutions. As you can see on this slide, these are the expectations of the society, of the consumers. Banks as one of the channels of servicing individual customers and corporate customers, of course, together with the consumer sector, with the trade sector, they feel the changing behavioral model. On this slide, I would like to demonstrate one of the examples of how this agenda impacts corporate governance. What I wanted to cover in my short speech. So these slides are based on the organizer's platform, and you'll be able to read through them in detail. On the part of Deloitte, I'd like to say that based on our experience, we cannot say that the ESG agenda or the climate agenda is fully covered without certain corporate changes. So this is the example of Raiffeisen Bank, and you can judge by this slide that the matters of sustainable development as a sort of an umbrella term are covered at all levels of corporate governance, starting from the board of directors or the supervisory board and down to working committees at the bottom. So the banks, as you can see here, it's also just the first step. And we must say that the cosmetic outer changes are not enough when the bank is seriously set to promote this agenda. Most often we see separate individual managers or directors at the level of executive boards or boards of directors. They are responsible for ESG or for sustainability, and there are also individual employees. If you use the English term chief sustainability officer, this function starts to appear. In the Russian practice, it's just the start. Sometimes there are even separate departments. Regulations are developed to support these processes. All of these steps, as we think, are quite necessary to support the infrastructure, to support the obligations that the banks take when they declare that they conform to ESG. This slide is to pay attention to the fact that the situation with the rate of ESG development varies region to region, sector to sector. Usually we see that the banking sector is the pioneer in the promotion of these trends, while the climate agenda or ESG as a whole, the banks are lagging behind a little bit. We see a lot of export-oriented areas, uh, including the ones in Russia, which are doing this uh, faster. So the banks have the opportunity to learn from their colleagues. The problem with corporate governance that the Russian banks are facing, and the banks in the CIS too, when they analyze their ambition in ESG, it's the lack of the necessary staff. Taxonomy is just forming in this area. Needless to say, there's a lack in the HR resources. So if we talk about the important goals that must be actively implemented, it's education in ESG agenda. This also includes reformatting specialists such as eco specialists, tech specialists, who very often only have a vague understanding of how the bank business works. So these specialists need to be integrated in this area. The market surely expects more active movement on behalf of the banks in this area. Of course, there are regulatory aspects, as we think trans-border carbon regulation, which right now is in its development, already became a very serious trigger of this agenda becoming more important for the Russian market. For the banks, is a direct challenge. So it's a challenge in working with specific customers, in assessing risks and outcomes of the transborder carbon regulation. So there are more questions than answers, but the process of transformation is going on very actively. On the next slide, as you can see, there are a couple of examples of the first public steps made in ESG in Russia. So this is the phenomenon that relates mainly to the largest banks. But we understand this is a very expensive piece of work, and it only starts with the biggest banks and the sort of a gap between the biggest banks and the smaller banks. So the association pays attention to this. I mean, the Russian Banking Association. It even creates a framework for future regulation in this area and a special work group to delineate the specific steps. So right now there are more and more sources of information and more examples that we can base on. On the next slide, you can see a fast reminder, so to speak, of the fact that, of course, the ESG transformation directly is linked to the changes in the corporate governance system. Of course, they do not cancel the work done before, but they serve as an addition, as a transformation, as a modification of it. We require a fundamental rethinking of many strategical goals of the banks. This includes the risk appetite. So the climate agenda, the ESG agenda as a whole, is very broadly covering this work. It's an illusion of hiring a local team into the bank and hoping that it will cover all of these matters. It's a matter of transformation of all the defense areas. So if we talk about corporate governance, for example, it goes down to every specific employee. So the internal education is very important. This slide is a resume, the potential opportunities and benefits from ESG integration. This is the result of Deloitte's research. It's evident it's the answer to the demands of the market, the demands of the regulators, and consumers too, who see that the agenda is changing. So the regulators are looking at this very, very closely. They look at the assessment of risks, including eco risks. I will say that, I said it about the first steps, but it's not exactly correct. It's very fragmentary work in various parts of ESG, various ESG elements, but it has been done for many, many years. But they were just individuals. So now the task is to bring this all together and form a general concept of ESG without the need to change uh, the corporate governance system, not to build it from scratch, but to integrate it very nicely. So I will repeat the main point of my presentation is to pay attention to the fact that the goal of the climate risks, the ESG agenda, covers all of the elements of corporate governance. So it actually requires serious transformation, change of all items from strategic down to the daily business ones. Ekaterina, thanks a lot. This was very, very interesting. I'm very glad to hear that you're recommending a system-based approach, because very often we're saying that it's not just about hiring the team, but it is a system level reformatting. This requires financial, energetic, and resource based foundation. We're in the process of this, so those who will start it earlier than later will, let's say, reach the required point faster, and they will have, or they will be able to spend less on that than the ones who do it later. But they will, of course, have some let's say, challenges that most pioneers face. I'm very glad that among our partners we have the leaders that you even mentioned in your presentation right now. It's that includes Sber. Let's welcome actually Tatiana Zavialova from Sber. Tell us, Tatiana, what is happening currently at Sber? What do you do at Sber on ESG? And maybe you can comment on Ekaterina's presentation too. Floor is yours. Elena, thank you very much for inviting me to this.
В традиционно очень интересном.
It's a sort of a very traditionally interesting discussion, very important and not an easy topic. Dear colleagues, hello to you all. I'd like to say that Ekaterina, I think it's a very good luck to speak after you, because you presented an overview of the approach to ESG transformation of the banks, and it will be easier for me now to cover the path that we're going along. We started this a bit late, as I think, but we're trying to be as active as possible in this inevitable process. So I'll tell you how we see the further steps, what we've done by now. And I think I will start by saying this. So why we are becoming part of this process, and with what sense we're putting in this process. So first of all, I'd like to say that the current situation with sustainable development already became the new business norm, the new business standard that we need to adapt to, all of us, to reconnect to it. Just a couple of examples why it is like that. We all know about the Paris Accords when it was made and signed. Not so much time has passed, happened in 2016, and more than 120 countries took the obligations to reach carbon zero. Many cities connected to the same task. And a fourth of Fortune 500 companies decided to do the same. In the whole world, investment that are currently made in ESG, in let's say protection of the environment, it's growing very, very fast. In the coming 30 years, it will require about 100 or 150 trillion dollars to reach zero carbon output around the world. This is about 3.5 trillion per year, a very serious number. This relates to Europe as well as such countries like China or the Gulf companies or the countries of the Indian region. Their scale just a couple of years ago were unrealistic. They seemed unrealistic. We won't cover Europe, they're not leaders here, but the United States are back into the Paris Accord. They actively did that. They are implementing innovation in a very broad area of eco-tech, such as batteries, also less production of carbon, electric cars too. The start of the year, MIT published a very interesting report. They analyzed they made a research, they called it the index of the green future. They reviewed the economies that presented 95% of the world's GDP. And so they estimated whether they were close to the green future. This index made by MIT unites the valuations received by each country or territory by 5 main areas. So this is carbon output, carbon dioxide, green society, clean innovations, and the climate policy. Of course, Europe will keep the leading positions. Out of the most advanced countries, 15 positions are occupied by Europe. The USA is just the 40th, China 45th, and Japan 60th. So the rating is headed by Iceland, Denmark, France, and Ireland. Out of the number of the leading countries, they developed already the legislative programs and measures which allow to stimulate innovation and the development of technology in sustainable development. France, for example, 4th place in the index, was the first in Europe that in 2018 adopted the energy and climate strategy. And it determined the main mechanisms, such as less consumption of energy out of the traditional energy sources. The plan is already a goal that the company is striving to. So they will stop producing energy based on carbon. By the end of next year, they will do that. And already today, France is already the world leader in the production of hydrogen. We are not in the top. Only Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are after us. So we are not actually in the top. So what does it mean for the economy and the country and all the companies and corporations, as well as the citizens of Russia?
That means that we will all have to cover a lot of ground and make bold strides towards ensuring compliance with new climate environmental standards and towards implementing sustainable development principles. I have to say that these ambitions, these challenges and opportunities seem like for Russia, this could be one of the most large-scale waves of changes, of transformations since the period of industrialization in the 1920s and 1930s. We'll see how we go through this, how we handle this. Sber cannot and should not and is not just standing by. We have been monitoring the expectations of regulators and shareholders and investors, and we clearly see that if a company does not have an ESG policy, this significantly restricts the company's access to financial resources. What is the evidence to that? The central banks of France and England said that they would conduct stress tests to check banks' resistance to climate risks. There is also mandatory environmental disclosure. Some other countries have been studying the feasibility of applying such stress test approaches. The US, which has been for a long time standing on the margins, has joined the other 80 central banks, the working group on building an environmentally friendly financial system. They have joined that group to exchange experience and knowledge. But action is taken not only on the level of regulators. These systemic changes are taking place elsewhere as well. In the private sector, for example. The Climate Action 100 Plus, which involves more than 500 institutional investors, together representing more than 47 trillion US dollars in assets under management. They have asked the company with the highest level of emissions to achieve zero emission status by 2050. This is concrete action. Concrete action in response to this request will clearly have a bearing on the attractiveness of investment into shares of such companies. Also, Ernst & Young in 2020 had a research that showed that the significance of ESG information, ESG disclosure is more significant now than before. 90% of respondents said that non-financial metrics play a key role in making investment decisions. And now a couple of words about our company, about Sber, and what we have been doing with regard to the ESG agenda within Sber and also with our customers. We have sorted out, we've structured our plan of action, and we have 7 main streams in that plan of action. Before I describe them, I would like to thank Ekaterina, because I think you very rightly mentioned that perfunctory gestures would not be enough. Real bona fide transformation can only happen when these ESG principles, ESG functions are implemented fully in all lines of work, all lines of activities, all units of the company. And the work processes should be adjusted accordingly. So our 7 streams, our 7 pillars in our approach, what we started with. Sber has achieved its first goal in carbon neutrality, a significant goal. We have formulated it as follows. By 2030, all Sberbank branches must be carbon neutral. That is just the first step. We will, of course, have more goals, more targets, but before we tackle those, we need to finish some of our internal exercises. This year, we will complete the assessment of Sber's carbon footprint and the carbon footprint of our portfolio using the methodology of the global standard. We will also prepare our first report in accordance with the CDP standard in July this year, and next year we will prepare our climate reporting under TCFD standard. By the end of this year, Sber will have developed and approved our own climate strategy, as part of which we will most probably set some other goals in terms of carbon neutrality of Sber according to a variety of metrics. Step number 2, we have already been implementing a set of measures to reduce our impact on the environment. We are starting with the most accessible steps and measures for us so far. This is also an important achievable goals. It would probably be unreasonable to set some global large-scale goal because you can only handle this step by step. So what are we doing first to optimize our environmental impact? We have started with reducing our consumption of electric. We have been having our branches transition to renewable energy sources. We've also been looking into modifying our fleet to include electrical vehicles. Also, over the last years, we have been going increasingly paperless. We have been reducing the amount of paper we use in our document flows, and we've been making steps toward that direction. We've also been involved in group and project activities aimed at carbon neutrality. Ekaterina, you mentioned that also changes start with awareness raising and education, and you cannot skip steps here. This step is also very important. We've been working on it very closely. International initiatives, such as this initiative right here, Russian initiatives. We've been involved with in the working group at the Central Bank and the Ministry of Economic Development. We've also been in close contact with the State Duma, the Council of Federations, and so on and so forth. We are members of multiple working groups, and we are also participating in a big project specifically on ESG. This is a pilot project in Sakhalin to make sure Sakhalin goes carbon neutral. The main goal for us as part of this project is to develop a system for trading, for carbon trade. This is going to be, of course, just a pilot, just a test project. And if it goes well, we'll be able to replicate that experience across the country. Once again, I reiterate that, in our opinion, it's very significant to raise awareness about climate risks, about climate finance risks at all levels, which we have been doing very actively. We need to support businesses in getting actively involved in these processes and adjusting their work to the carbon neutral future. Step 4, we've been employing new methods to develop our business, taking into consideration the ESG parameters. We have to do business. We cannot forget about that, but we need to adjust in accordance with the new reality. The total amount of loans disbursed by Sber, taking on board the ESG factors, just in the first quarter, amounted to 52 billion rubles. One of the recent examples of how we support businesses. On the 20th of April, Sberbank and the Открытие Bank announced the financing of the project to build a plant called Ecoland, due for commissioning in 2025. What is Ecoland? This is a metallurgical complex of a full cycle where steel is produced out of metal ore and natural gas through direct reconstruction, which will reduce threefold the amount of emissions as opposed to the traditional means of steel production. This is a very concrete example, a recent example of how we employ these ESG tools. Step 5. We have our loan policy, our risk management policy, which we try to implement in accordance with the expectations of our major investors and factor in environmental and climate risks, and also factoring in the impact of the environmental impact of potential customers and projects. By 2023, we will have completed 100% of our credit portfolio screening by these parameters. 6th step. We've been implementing a modern system of ESG management, which will factor in climate factors. The responsibility has been assigned at all levels, starting from the supervisory board and all the way down the line. We have a board member, an officer on the board who is responsible for that line of work. We have respective KPIs for our business blocks and our functional subdivisions. All in all, these are very big, large-scale changes which we are now rolling out and which we're going to improve by the end of this year. We've already developed relevant internal efficiency metrics, performance metrics. We have a system for monitoring our own impact. For example, energy efficiency metrics. We have climate projects implemented in a variety of business segments, starting from the assessment of carbon footprint for retail customers, which is a pilot project for us, and all the way to special index strategies for investment solutions, for investment decisions. For example, when it comes to the food industry, we have a special index, carbon footprint reduction index for global companies, which are working in compliance with the circular economy principles. And in conclusion, a couple of words about our, last but not least, 7th step. We support the development and distribution of new policies in low carbon transformation. We've been investing in development of renewable energy, in development of alternative methodology of accounting and recycling. The amount of loans for this alternative energy sector has exceeded 65 million rubles. A lot of the projects that we financed have already been commissioned. Just a couple as an example. In the region of Stavropol, one of the biggest solar energy plants has already been commissioned. In the cities of Volgograd, in Bashkortostan, in the city of Samara, we have similar plants, solar plants. There's a wind plant, wind station commissioned. The wind plant, Kolskaya wind plant, beyond the polar ring, and a number of other large projects in that line of work. To sum up, once again, I'll go full circle to the beginning. When we talk about ESG transformation, we need to keep in mind that this is inevitable. This is the new normal of doing business, a new reality, and the banking sector, which is indeed an integral part of decision-making in a lot of industries, plays a very significant, a very prominent role. We need to be involved and we need to exchange our experience, support each other, and go forward with boldness. Thank you, Tatiana, for this succinct and fascinating presentation, a very interesting overview of global trends, global ESG trends, and the description of Sberbank's steps. That sounds like a very like a brilliant undertaking. I'm glad to hear that you have a clear roadmap with clear stages towards carbon neutrality. Sberbank is truly a pioneer, setting the trend not just for the banking sector, but impacting the whole Russian economy. To build up on the topic of leadership in sustainable development, we cannot help but mention the role of the board of the company that of companies that strive to be driving. One of the major banks has created an ESG committee on the board and plans to implement projects of up to 600 million rubles in that venue. I give the floor to Natalia Tretyak, the first vice president of Gazprom Bank, to talk about what Gazprom Bank has been doing. Olga, thank you very much for inviting me here. Let me begin my presentation. Slide 2, please. I'd like to build upon what the previous speakers have said, that the ESG parameters have been becoming more and more prominent. A lot has been depending on climate risks. Taking into consideration the ESG factors by rating of the world have been including ESG assessment in the lending processes. For banks, this means something inevitable. We have to consider ESG factors and incorporate them into our activities. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Speaking of the goals that the banks need to achieve to make sure the ESG agenda is not just a formality in the bank's activities, but an integral part of them. First and foremost, we need to make all these steps that Ekaterina was talking about in order to make the ESG processes at the banks not just official, but bearing a clear impact on our work. I agree with the previous speakers. This cannot be just a perfunctory gesture. Transitioning to sustainable development principles requires a systemic, a very painstaking effort to change all the lines of work at the bank.
The bank is actually working very actively in this part, and there's a special committee on ESG development. There's the Sustainable Development Officer, and so the board is working in a broad spectrum of this. There's a policy of sustainable development as part of the strategy of the bank. Of course, we see our goal in expanding responsible financing. And Gazprom Bank in this area is one of the key banks employing these tools right now. I'll cover this in more detail later. Working with customers is a very important part. For Gazprom Bank, where customers there are many customers with a, let's say, a long carbon trail, who in our risk culture and in their risk culture, there should be estimation of the importance of the impact of ESG factors on the sustainability. Of course, we must work on decreasing the impact of our activities on the environment, plus the social responsibility of the bank before the society. Next slide, please. Olga Elena said it very rightly that the Russian Federation in the recent past is actively developing its regulatory work in sustainable development. There are green and social bonds developed by the Bank of Russia. 5 Russian verifying agencies confirmed that there's independent external assessment of the green bond, social bond, and sustainable development bonds. Taxonomy is developed by WebRF Bank. Here I must underline the importance of the work group of the Association of the Banks of Russia. This is very important for a regulator that all of the market participants are participating. So the role of the Russian banks is very important here. We must help our regulator implement all the necessary support measures that will allow green financing to actually be effective, to apply the world's best practices. The areas of responsible financing and approaches used by the bank in its activities. I will cover them right now. One of them is this one, yes, the tools of green financing, expanding the spectrum of projects that conform to the sustainable development process. The bank is a leader among the banks on financing sustainable energy projects. 64% of these projects is financed by us. And if we talk about numbers, it's more than 100 billion rubles and the production of more than 1 gigawatt of energy. Gazprom Bank is very actively financing the projects of, let's say, moving the transport from gasoline to hydrogen and other gas fuels. This is not just the loan part, we're going to the capital markets too, by changing the infrastructure and project financing. In 2013, built 2019, built 28 objects of such infrastructure. Together with the Russian eco-operator, we're working on processing hard and garbage. We're using the tool of state-private cooperation, developing alternative transport infrastructure and employing electricity in public transport, for example, in the tram line in St. Petersburg. This helps a lot to decrease the CO2 exhaust. It helps a lot. In addition to that, Gazprom Bank is very actively using the tools, the instruments of the debt capital market. We are the largest bank by the number of issuers who have the bonds that are in line with sustainable development. So this includes green bonds, social bonds as well. I must underline that the social part, especially during the pandemic, has increased its impact. We think it's a very prospective mechanism in the world and in Russia. And we have all the necessary capabilities for that. As I said, it is very, very important for us to work with the customers, especially considering the structure of our customers. So at the bank, there's a special customer consultation center. We help our customers improve their customers to rebuild their business processes based on the principles used in sustainable development. By the same, so that they help the ESG to proliferate. We help our customers issue the bonds so that they can get the money of responsible investors. So within our structure, there's a special center uh, as part of the Gazprom Bank structure. So there's a whole network of internationally certified eco experts. So by that, we can help our customers implement uh, the ESG projects. For example, to modernize the internal infrastructure that can result in less impact on the environment. We're now also processing the models of sustainable lending, where we'll be able to link the loan interest rate to ESG indicators. We're working very actively to improve our own profile. So this relates to such things as information disclosure and clarity. Like Sberbank, we're working to decrease our own negative impact on the environment. So we're going paperless already. It allows to use less paper. Plus, we're using secondary products made from recycled materials. Plus, we expect that in the near future, the board of the bank will adopt the eco policy. In general, I am sure that banks can become real drivers of the development of responsible and green agenda in Russia. And we very well understand that without the financial part of this whole story, this transformation in the world in Russia is just impossible. So Ekaterina gave us the estimation how much this can cost. So with 150 trillion rubles, but if we take the social factor in, this number will be much bigger. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for the fact that you became a platform where we can exchange experience, where we can consolidate our efforts, so that we can together be more effective in reaching the goals set by the UN Convention and generally by common sense to develop our country. Natalia, thank you. Market leaders are going hand in hand in one and the same format. We're all speaking the same language, we're having the same values. I think it's fantastic that we're all adhering to the fact that Ekaterina covered at the start. Form should not be over function and content, so it will not be a problem anymore. In my work, I pay attention to that right now it's still more about form. It's still there. but anyway, we're in the process of improvement. Sber, Gazprom Bank, and we'll listen about Sovcombank too. I'm very glad that they participate very much, they and the investors, in ESG projects. There's a lot of equity there. They provide special financing, green loans, and they impact the business environment, not just by saying things, but by actually providing special financing. Of course, cash matters here. It's the oxygen of this whole process. So without financing, I don't think there will be any change. Thank you very much. I will now pass the floor to Regina von Fleming. It's very interesting to listen about the ESG part in Sovcombank and how you impact the business perimeter. And maybe you can also comment on the things covered before, maybe in terms of a proactive approach. Regina, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I will speak this morning English because I'm still suffering from a quite big flu. First of all, I would like to welcome the diversity aspect this morning. So far, we only had female speakers, which makes me always happy to work in Russia, and is not a discrimination against the male speakers following me. Sovcombank, we started an ESG committee on the board level in October 2020. I'm also, by the way, the chairman of the ESG committee at MTS on the board. The emergency and urgency was, I think, wisely understood by the board of directors or supervisory board of directors of Sovcombank. They have been one of the there are two members so far in Russia of the United Nations principles. Yekaterina mentioned one bank before. Sovcombank is also an early mover. And I do not want to tell you the roadmap we are undergoing at the moment at Sovcom. It is all mentioned by my colleagues from Sberbank as well as Gazprom Bank. It goes from internal carbon footprint to thinking and discussing on the next board the net zero banking, the global compact accelerate program, as well as our ratings. So despite of the fact that Sovcombank is not fully floated on the stock exchange yet, probably, I think Sovcom is quite avant-garde in this topic. I think everything mentioned so far was extremely interesting, and I want to throw a couple of key words or key aspects in the discussion. First of all, I do believe that banks are internationally the locomotive and have a key role in the development of the overall macroeconomic goal of 2050. Having said so, and I think it was quite good mentioned by my speaker before me from Gazprom Bank, banks have a transitional role. It is an assistance, it is a transitional transformer role where we are in a key position to assist our clients. And of course, it is extremely important, as mentioned before, tone from the top as well from the supervisory board, going down, trickle down in all departments and included in business solutions, as well as training and HR development. I see regulators, if in Russia or other countries, I see it as a plus, that we still have the room for creatively co-working with regulators on legislation, because it's such a new topic and we all understand that we have a big problem with understanding scope 3. We have sometimes double amounting, we have sometimes a lack of data. We have sometimes also systemic risk. So therefore, I think it is extremely important that all banks and financial institutions are joining nationally as well as supranational in order to work together with the regulator. And I don't see regulation as a threat. And here I give a big compliment to the Russian Central Bank. I think the so far published regulations are quite sufficient. I can compare it to the German ones from the BaFin, Bundesamt für Finanzen, as well as from the European Central Bank. So I think we are not lacking in Russia behind at all. And I see it as a big chance. Let me talk a little bit about the comment Yekaterina Trofimo said, that the clients so far are not as well as informed. We can see it in other sectors, that client movements or civil society demands are popping over to Russia quite quick. So I expect in a year and a half, and we can see it already at MTS and telecommunications, that, for example, 5G implementation or electrosmog are clients and customers' concern. And I expect it in the future. If we look at retail, for example, I'm in close exchange with X5 at the moment. Packaging, for example, is coming. So I expect it also in the banking products, a little bit longer probably, but the awareness will swap over borders and doesn't stop. The product side, I think, is quite nicely developing in Russia. If it is the sustainability linked loans, as well as green bonds and green sort of obligations, as well as social impact. Same to SoftBank and dollar. MTS started now sort of issuing a green bond as well. I see big problems in diversifying and segmenting industrial sort of sectors. Yekaterina mentioned it before, that she said the bad energies are clearly very soon and pretty identified. We have a great example with coal mining, but here we need really to define much more and go into the industries, as well as understanding the producers and the suppliers, coming back to the scope 3 double accounting, as well as upstream and downstream. And I think we need a little bit more closer refinement on these topics in Russia in the future, due to the fact that the dirtiest, if we come to CO2 emissions, is too easy. And Yekaterina mentioned it already in her first sort of statement. This is only the first overview or the macro view, but we should really sort of focus now more going into industries and portfolios and segmenting branches and industries much more clearly and defined, because we need to reflect it in our lending policy. And we cannot only focus on energy or those sort of typical suspects, and we need more work. And I would highly appreciate a sort of better exchange with other banks in Russia on these topics. We also, I think, need to really learn to understand the role of the banks in risk mitigation, in measuring and managing. I've mentioned it before. The identification of risk mitigation in sort of lending policies means we need data, means we need to understand much more what are we talking about. We all understand that, and I give an example of 2003, when we had the OECD Codex of Compliance, where we all started in Russia asking and counter-checking our suppliers and partners in business on compliance issues. It was on a free basis. It was mainly done in the form of a questionnaire. Here it goes to substance. Here it goes, and Yekaterina mentioned also, the export-driven industry in Russia is already quite pretty prepared, because otherwise they cannot enter European or foreign markets exporting from Russia. But for the local domestic market, here we need more and clearly defined rules. And we need to understand how are we achieving the databases, especially for scope 3, in order to really reflect the full picture. My last comment, sometimes I'm a little bit puzzled by investors. With MTS, we have 49% of foreign investors, mainly Anglo-Saxon, all the big suspects, BlackRock, Lazar, and so on and so on. I'm now more than happy to start a questionnaire back to the investors. What do you want? Investors sometimes come back with a very simple one. Are you paying attention to ESG, yes or no? And I say yes. But the definition and the side of definition needs to be much more refined and national and sort of supranationally sort of addressed. The sort of European Central Bank statement that the impact of climate change is a major source of systemic risk when conducting preliminary stress tests could lead to elevated capital requirements for banks and exposed to higher levels of climate risk. We are forced, on one hand, with the UK streamlined energy and carbon reporting scheme, then we are forced with from investors' side with the task force on climate-related financial disclosures on scope 3 emissions. And this is important, for example, when BlackRock endorses this framework and has asked public companies to align their reporting, it is a little bit contradicting to other sort of requirements. And I'm getting a little bit more puzzled. What do they want? Do they want to click the box as well? Do they really mean it serious? How deep do I have to answer when? And speaking to a lot of international IR, investor relations community, yesterday I had advice from the German Corporate Governance Codex between two hands, where I'm a member. They said, promise something until 2050, and then try to sort of show that you're working on it, on a process, and communicate in a proper way it's underway. And I said, guys, I'm an honest person. 2050, I'm already dead, unfortunately. This is the nature of, I can sign now whatever protocol, but I need to understand how deep do you want this and how deep are you punishing us? MTS is New York stock listed. And how should I sort of go with a simple analyst question? And how far and deep should I go with a highly committed private equity fund like BlackRock or Lazars? And this is really puzzling me because we are at the moment at the beginning, which is a great chance in Russia. We have the chance to start from scratch with data collection, which is really great because we are not sort of coming from nothing. We have the government sort of opinion that this is necessary and this should be done. We have a very proactive regulator with the Russian Central Bank. We have a banking sector who understands that this is necessary and wants to do it, but we need to understand also from all stakeholders what are the demands. So in a nutshell, clients, I think, will come in Russia in a year and a half, two latest, or consumers. Regulator, I think it's a great chance because we can still discuss and give our ideas of practicability. Investor side, I have big question marks how we should react and what do they want and what sort of deepness of level. Training education is happening and underway, but we need harmonization of international standards and we need to understand what are the rules and, of course, last but not least, how much does it cost and what gives it out? We still have to earn money. We still have to make critical decisions. And my last sentence on this topic, the critical sort of major decisions I'm waiting for now is not only harmonizing standards and requirements, but also a very substantial for SOFCOM, very substantial decision is nuclear energy, green or not green. European Commission report, internal report of the expert council to the European Commission a week and a half ago, and I was amazed, said, for us, nuclear power is still green. By the way, a big slap into the face of Chancellor Merkel, because she said nuclear power is definitely not green, and she stopped and stepped out. So if this is going to happen, then we have a transitional period, which is, for example, for Rosatom, a big client of all of our banks we are discussing here, 36 projects abroad at the moment, is a very crucial one because, for example, financing Rosatom, like all banks we do, means we are putting ourselves under exposure for the future if this will be globally sort of not considered as green energy. Interesting topic. Scope 3 I have my question marks on the banking sector. How can we sort of really show it? But on the other hand, I think in Russia, we are on a great way and moving in big steps. And what I like about Russia, since 25 years working there and living there, if Russia starts, it starts with a big, big speed. And that's what I love, because probably later than other countries, but here on a very good path. Thank you.
Спасибо, Регина. Очень интересно было услышать ваше мнение, потому что вы говорили как раз...
Thank you very much. Thank you for your opinion. You were talking from the perspective of the board member in the banking sector, in the real economy. That's very valuable. And myself, as someone who has been an investor in a large investment company in Europe, I very well understand what you said about investors. It's not quite clear what the investors expect, and that truly is a big concern for companies, for investors themselves, because there is not a single, unified framework of information that they are requesting. Every asset manager has its own ESG department. That ESG department comes to us with their matrix, with their expectations of how you incorporate ESG factors in assessment of assets for different companies. And speaking of Russia and other emerging markets, this gets even more complicated. So yes, I agree. This is a very interesting, very relevant topic. And I hope that very soon, the global industry will come to a single shared framework. And now I would really love to hear from our European colleagues who turned towards ESG way back. The ING Bank in the Netherlands is very likely moving towards radical reduction of its emissions, and has also been making very stringent requirements to their investment portfolio customers and projects. For example, by 2025, they're committed to stop financing coal projects altogether. Please welcome the CEO of ING Bank Eurasia, Mikhail Chaikin, who will hopefully talk about the journey of ING and the challenges they've addressed along the way. Mikhail, you are on mute. Yes, sorry. Hello, colleagues. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to thank the previous speakers. A lot has been said. I'll try to be brief, and I'll try to maybe fill in the gaps and mention things that haven't been quite elaborated on yet. Next slide, please. What is ING? ING is almost 40 million customers in 40 countries worldwide. Out of the 40 million customers, only several dozens of thousands are corporate customers. The rest are retail customers. What are the characteristic traits of the retail portfolio? Mainly, these customers are middle class in the most developed countries of Europe. That is the population that has the largest safety net, and people that are doing pretty well in life. These people clearly and reasonably expect that some of their higher tier needs will also be satisfied. ING is a financial institute that is very much targeting this stratum of consumers, has become a pioneer in terms of ESG. Under the pressure of its own customers, its own regulators, so to speak, the customers that make up the most of the customer base. Back in 2007, ING as a standalone company was climate neutral, was carbon neutral. Since then, we have been working to implement the ESG agenda in our practices, and communities, social organizations, climate rating agencies have come to an understanding that a bank per se does not really play that prominent of a role in terms of climate impact, carbon impact, but its portfolio of customers, that is where the bank has the strongest prominence, and this is where the bank could have the biggest impact on its borrowers, its customers, and investment goals. In 2014, the bank created a group, next slide please, the group that started to step by step thoroughly analyze this environmental impact and what that is at all. We've outlined two streams: climate action. This is where the bank independently or through its products could have an impact on the ESG situation with a customer or an industry or a region. And this is also about risks, climate risks, the other stream, the risks that could have a very real impact on the interests of the banks and its security. As we all know, large banks do not make large decisions simply out of greed. They are mostly motivated by risks. So when these two streams combined, ING realized that the answer is quite simple. You either wait for the risks to materialize and then you respond to those risks, or you could lead the way and address social pressure, political pressure, and move in acceleration of what is being done in the market in terms of risk management. Next slide, please. The project called Terra. As I said, this approach was adopted at the bank, and ING started joining various supranational projects, initiatives. In 2018, for example, the first joint project of 4 banks was launched, was committed to in Katowice. ING officially committed to have its entire loan portfolio of 600 billion euros will be transformed in accordance with the Paris Agreement principles, the Paris Agreement goals. It was an official document signed back then, and since then we have joined a lot of other projects and initiatives and programs. Next slide, please. For example, in 2019, ING, together with 38 other largest banks, signed a follow-up to the Katowice commitment. Thus, the work that previously had been done only within the bank independently on a standalone basis, it became international. Next slide. What are the declarations signed by large banks based on, and what does that mean for the banks organization-wise? As I said, initially, it was just a project team called Terra, the team that was analyzing climate risks and associated pressure. Starting from 2018, organizationally speaking, the situation changed. In accordance with the international treaties, international agreements, the bank has analyzed its portfolio and chose several largest industries in terms of their environmental impact. In each industry, we took steps to reduce carbon footprint to achieve the 2-degree goal. These sectors, these industries, as Regina was saying, these include not just the very obvious industries, but also some domestic sectors. ESG is, of course, much more prominent in such sectors as real estate, mortgage. So in each of these sectors, we adopted a scientifically based methodology. Next slide. Next one. So this is a scientifically based methodology which allows the bank to assess internally the progress and the situation with its loan portfolio from the perspective of customers. It allows us to monitor how the portfolio has been developing, to which extent the carbon footprint is reducing, and are we at all moving in the right direction in line with the Paris Agreement. In 2020, the bank, for the second time, disclosed its report on this line of work. The report garnered a lot of largely positive attention from the investors. They appreciated the status, the results, and the methodology, which was based on scientific findings. We used the methodology to assess the situation in the portfolio, the situation with the customers. And it became clear that the bank has been moving towards its ESG goals, has really been changing the profile of its investment, and the situation overall became much more transparent. This methodology, as I said, is based on science, on scientific findings, the findings of international rating agencies, and some other companies in the industry.
So the report looks like this. On these graphs, you can see the industry norm of expected decrease of climate impact and where the bank's portfolio is located in reference to the industry norm. So this can be evaluated by consumers, by investors, very directly and clearly. And so they can understand whether the bank is doing enough to reach the Paris Climate Accords in these 9 areas. This is public information. The sources of the methodology are also public. So Russia has an advantage on this. We don't have to invent anything. We just must understand whether these are applicable for our country. Let's look at the next slide. So what I wanted to show additionally is that for every sector, you can see the measurement methodology, the source of this methodology, and what is organizationally behind it. Before that, the project team within the organization was in a sort of isolation. So it was just the let's say the understanding of the top management. They say that it's important for the bank, that the portfolio should be based on that. But as of now, it's a full internal system where there's a second line of defense. That's the people who estimate risks and validate the methodology used. And in every of these 9 sectors, in the front office and the customer organization, there's a center of expertise, which on the level of selecting the transactions or selecting the actions on existing transactions in the portfolio, evaluates their adherence to the sector methodology. So there's a specific system, just like with the credit risks, or compliance risks, or even market risks. So the front office chooses the projects or transactions by itself, governed by these goals. Then they bring it to risks where there's the ESG component, and risks estimate whether the front office is aggressive or not aggressive, etc., etc. So this is how it works operationally. Let's look at the next slide. Here we're giving additional template for power generation. These are the curves of the International Energy Agency. So the indicators that are required for the Paris Accords, the so-called decarbonization pathways. So it's very evident. And you can see the ING portfolio here. Year on year, depending on the year, do we build a power plant in Indonesia or not, for example, carbon-based. So a very sensible, specific approach of project evaluation. This is also what we show to our investors. This is the so-called green risk appetite. Let's look at the next slide. Same thing in steel industry. A very similar picture. There's international acknowledged scenario. We look at the portfolio, look at the technology, which are acceptable in the process of decreasing the carbon footprint. If you look at the blocks below, you can see there's just improvement of efficiency, or the effect the effect is not very high. There's the carbon storage, which is better, more efficient, and then carbon utilization and let's say, disruptive projects and hydrogen metallurgy. This slide shows how every sector is looking at its portfolio of loans, customers, etc., etc. The whole sector, the whole portfolio, transactions that are part of this portfolio is in the block, sort of put into blocks based on their technological state and based on investment in a new low carbon capacity. So if we
квадратике, то, соответственно, к 40-му году мы ожидаем, что большинство
by now
будет находиться в верхнем правом квадратике. Опять же, напомню, почему
find themselves in the top right corner. So why the bank thinks this is important? Because if you look at the development of the markets and the society, we think that the ones which will not make it from the top left to bottom left to top right, they will either lose value or, which is also bad, will lose the liquidity. A very simple example. If you're last of the three banks who are ready to finance a carbon shaft, a carbon extraction shaft, so who will refinance it if you're the last one? No one will get will want to buy it, or you will get a non-performing loan, will get approval, and will not be able to do anything. This is a direct risk. For Russia, this risk was very low, but I can say that in Germany or in Poland, this risk is more present. So the banks are looking for those who are not yet there, they're able to sell this to them. And those are not in a very pleasant situation. There's regulatory and public pressure on them that they're financing something bad. Plus, this asset is not very effective and you can't refinance it in any way. No one will buy it. No one will purchase. So this is a very bad part of the portfolio. You can't earn anything on it and you can't sell it either. These are the practical aspects that I wanted to include into our discussion. As far as Russia is concerned, I will drop some of the slides. The so-called sustainability improvement loans. We made the first transaction with Polymetal, and then 3 or 4 transactions of this kind, mainly with metallurgy companies, who were pioneers because they're export-oriented. They're working in the export-oriented field, whether you like it or not. They just had to do this. So we disbursed first loans to them. The interest rate for them was linked to their improving credit rating. No, wait, not credit rating, eco rating, their ESG rating. So now there are more complex structures. For example, they're not linked directly to that, but they are linked to KPIs on improving ESG. And we see that the market generally is developing very fast. If Russia is starting to move in a certain direction, it moves there full force. So we not feel the pioneers anymore on the Russian market as it was 3 or 4 years ago. And we try to keep up with the rest and to introduce something new. In conclusion, I'd like to say that the bank is a blood vessel system, but it's also a social institution. So the social policy, the social component, it's very big in the process of making decisions. So while our society and investors will formulate what they want, for us it will remain a very big component of our activities, one of the main principles which we must govern. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Mikhail, I have a short question. Please remind us in which year you disbursed this loan to Polymetal? I don't think it was very long time ago. 3 or 4 years ago, maybe. Maybe if you 2018. 2018. But since then, 3 more years have passed. So the metallurgy guys, they were the first, and they understood it very fast. So you're not alone there anymore, right? I'm very glad that you're market leaders. Everyone is moving very fast and with a good results. Thanks, Mikhail. I think it's we'll have Andrei Yakushin. I think everyone mentioned central bank today, and Andrei Yakushin is from the central bank. Andrei is our regular speaker, and he provides the latest, most actual information, what is done at the central bank. And of course, in the context of the banking sector, it is especially useful to listen to him and exchange opinions. Andrei, thank you very much. Floor is yours right now. Hello, dear colleagues. I can say that the speeches were interesting today. I would like to thank all of the speakers for their insights. The things that are very useful for us, because the sustainable development agenda and the risks related to the climate change are, of course, important for us as a regulator, and we are concerned about that. So there are 2 key questions. First is development of the financial market, development of the new financial instruments for sustainable development to ensure the financing of ESG projects and ensuring financial stability at the same time. So it means that by our regulation, with our activities, we must analyze this process and understand how these risks will implement the organizations supervised by us. So there are 2 key goals in sustainable development for us. This is based on what I said before, creating conditions for the financing of Russian sustainable development projects. We must give the public the opportunity to invest in the stable future, and the companies to have funds for such projects. And these projects are aimed at improving the eco component. Second goal is the adaptation of the participants of the market to the new risks that appear due to climate change and due to the activities of the governments of various states. The policies aimed at reducing climate change. Today we already spoke about ESG banking, and right now as the initiative of the UN on ecology, so this financial initiative, there are already principles of responsible banking. Not so many international organizations joined but enough of these organizations. They're available of UNEP-FI website. You can look at them there. And the last month, the Committee on Banking Supervision published 2 reports looking at the risk drivers, risks appearing for the banking sector due to the climate change. At the end of last year, we conducted a survey for systemically important financial institutions, and we saw that the very big number of our biggest banks, the overwhelming majority, are developing within the ESG agenda, and they realize that there are risks that appear due to climate change. But also, during this report, we saw that the bank said the ESG risks are operational risks, but it's not the same with the points made by the Basel Committee. It said that the climate risks are reflected in all key risks. Credit risks, because you know the decrease of the cost of the assets, and also the lack of deterioration of the financial standing of the borrowers. There are different risks. So there's a transitional risks. This also affects the cost of securities. So this may lead to the decrease of trade portfolio of the bank. So these are liquidity risks because they're related to the climate change. Plus, it impacts the general liquidity of the companies. So it's subject to change and risks related to climate change. Of course, this includes operational risks and reputation risks. Clients and investors, one by one, especially starting with foreign participants of the market, they're changing their preferences, and so they prefer not to buy products and services of companies that are not ESG compliant, and they don't want to invest in such companies. This was widely voiced during this conference. So if the organizations don't understand the risks that may arise out of this change, of course, it's not good, and all organizations must realize that these effects are present. So I spoke about the risks a little bit. Now about what we do in the development of the financial market and development of these instruments. You know, banks, in the Bank of Russia, there's a special group on the sustainability. This is a top-level group, and to support it, there are a couple of subgroups which analyze the suggestions, the changes in approaches, adoption of international approaches, you know, those aimed at achieving sustainable development goals. One of the subgroups is devoted to the development of the financial instruments. And as part of this subgroup, we work on non-prudential stimuli that can be used with various financial instruments, to the legal base and creating new types of bonds on the Russian market. So we're now also thinking about making standards to the issue standard for securities that would reflect the international approach for responsible bonds. We think about introducing the creation of opportunities of sustainability-linked bonds to the Russian market, general corporate bonds linked to KPIs, that have to do with sustainable development goals. And what is especially important for our companies and for our investors, they are the so-called climate transitional bonds. The bonds which on the international markets are starting to get traction, and they give the opportunity for the companies from dirty sectors to get investment for to finance the climate transition for more efficient and green low carbon production.
And that is also relevant for them improving their climate metrics. We've also been working on developing green mortgages in Russia. We are already actively involved with the Dom RF. We also plan to intensify our communication with the Ministry of Construction in order to employ these green mortgage tools. We've also sent a proposal to the Ministry of Economic Development, the proposition about macroprudential stimuli, which we think would be reasonable for green transitional financial instruments. This is a working group that works specifically with financial instruments. So tomorrow we're going to have a meeting of an interdisciplinary working group under the auspices of the Ministry of Economic Development on these documents to make a decision on following up on them in the government. We also have a subgroup on information disclosure about corporate governance. We have been working on non-financial information disclosure for public joint stock companies, and also we have been working on a framework for environmental disclosures in general to be incorporated in the corporate governance code, which already has certain provisions about the work of the board of directors on the ESG agenda and information disclosure, but those provisions are rather scarce and they do not elaborate enough on these principles. Information disclosure is done based on the CMB framework and the GRI standards. This is an advisory document, a recommendation document community, which can be used for developing a unified standard for environmental disclosure. At the IFRS, they're working on the International Sustainability Reporting Board, which, with the IOSCA coordinating role, will be developing this same unified standard for disclosure. But we would like to issue our recommendations a bit earlier, before that standard is provided, so that public companies, and here I wanted to mention that a lot of public joint stock companies in Russia have already been disclosing environmental information, still would like to promote this, popularize this among those companies that are not doing it yet. We also want investors to have enough information on the ESG factors to assess risks and capabilities of such public companies. And we want companies to generally be used to disclosing. Going forward, we will be analyzing the opportunity to set regulatory requirements to ESG disclosure. Clearly, the engagement of the board is extremely important. In order to look into the possibilities to prevent, to fight climate change. It is key for companies when we work on improving corporate governance practices. as part of promoting that code, we have been discussing it with a lot of companies and corporate secretaries, people who work with the boards. They have been very thankful for our recommendation letters, because they can go to the board with the recommendations from the Bank of Russia, and this way they can motivate the board to pay closer attention to certain corporate governance issues. With the ESG topic, we expect the same effect with our recommendations, where such recommendations can be passed over to the board and can be within their focus of attention. We are really committed to raising such awareness, and as previous speakers said, it is very important to develop the human resources, because the board must very clearly understand the risks that are associated with the ESG factors. So far, I don't think we can say that, say, 90% of companies have boards which realize such risks. Of course, there are those at the forefront which are paving the way, which participate in conferences and raise awareness this way. And that is very much appreciated, as well as the experience of companies that already have ESG committees and ESG roadmaps. Companies that have been cascading from top all the way down to rank and file employees, approaches that factor in ESG components. That is a big achievement. That is great progress, and I'm very thankful to these companies for such effort. We have another subgroup that works on stress testing, and as part of that working group, we also meet with financial and non-financial organizations. We discuss their approaches to ESG risks. This could be, as I said, non-financial organizations. It could be about cross-border carbon regulation, for example, which implemented in the European Union could have an impact on such companies. If it's such an organization, a financial organization, what kind of impact will ESG risks have on their portfolios? Another subgroup that deals with issues mentioned on several occasions today, meaning the way the bank itself can transition to SDG implementation. What can the bank do inside? Some of the speakers mentioned going paperless, and that's what we've been doing as well. We also analyze the energy efficiency of our facilities. We plan to take into consideration the ESG agenda in our procurement processes. Someone has mentioned electrical vehicles. We've been looking into that as well. We've conducted a survey among our employees, and we received answers from more than 900 people saying what we can do to improve, to streamline our economic activities in line with ESG. And one more topic. The carbon units. I have another subgroup working on that topic in order to work out the best approaches for the Russian Federation in that line of work. I think that's it for me, for my presentation. That's our agenda. That's what we've been doing on the ESG agenda. We believe that we have covered quite a lot of ground, and we hope that the market will be developing very successfully. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrei. Once again, a very comprehensive, interesting presentation. I would like to also join the compliments of the previous speakers about what the Bank of Russia is doing. You are indeed acting in a balanced and at the same time progressive way. And you are a great example for the banks in how they should implement sustainable development principles in their work. A quick question to you. You mentioned that you focus on recommendations to board members. Could you very briefly say which is your main recommendation? What do you think board members should do primarily to be in line with your criteria? Well, I'm not going to describe all the recommendations, especially seeing how they are still being discussed. I think the key thing that the board members can do is recognize the risks and opportunities that arise in association with climate change and foster this understanding of how material for the company these risks and opportunities are. That, in turn, will have an influence on the decision-making. Risks and opportunities, the two things that are always interconnected. For different companies, climate change could be fraught with mostly risks or mostly opportunities. So board members should pay due attention to that. These issues should certainly be discussed and assessed. That's probably the main recommendation. I completely agree. Oh, sorry, Regina wanted to say something.
Andrei, I would like to welcome what you said. I think it is a risk and opportunity. And of course, we need, as I mentioned before, to pay attention to the risk mitigation. But I see, especially in Russia, it's a great opportunity. And this is also why I want to stress the point, the regulator for me is not a threat. It is a sort of add-on. So again, what the Bank of Russia so far did in comparison, I can only compare to European Union, European Central Bank and BaFin. I think you are assisting us because we are liable. That means our liability in front of New York Stock Exchange, for example, at MTS. So you help me with your regulatory framework that I understand my code of conduct, which I have to communicate in governance, in corporate governance, as well as risk mitigation. So again, I think, and I would like to say it really loud, a big compliment to the Bank of Russia so far. The way you proceed the regulatory framework, for me, is one of the state of the art. And it's a big compliment because I'm a little bit separate and discussed about the European Central Bank, because this is a little bit sort of chaotic and not understood, because probably we have too much lobbying interest here from industries or lobbyists or whatever. So the strict governance so far is assisting us. And for me, it's a big opportunity because I have to match and I even have to show in my liability as a board member, I can do it better. So for me, it is a big, big, big chance. And again, the speed, 10 years project in the West, I have to say, chapeau, as you say in French. So I take it as a big plus. And I'm always happy and willing to support this opinion outside Russia, whoever asks me or will ask me, but I take it as a plus.
Спасибо, Регина. Да, спасибо, Регина.
Thank you so much, Regina. I think at this major optimistic note, we can wrap up the first session in our practice. That is 45 minutes beyond the schedule. This means that all the participants were truly inspired by this topic, and a lot of us have a lot of things to say, a lot of concerns. That is understandable, but I very much hope that each of us will achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. Thank you so much. We very much appreciate your participation and your perspectives. Let's continue with our cooperation. Yes, thank you, colleagues. Let's stay in touch. The video recordings will be available, of course, so any questions you may have, we'll be happy to take them offline. I'm also happy to see that in this line of work, we also have great basis for collaboration. Thank you and bye-bye.
Всего доброго, до свидания. Спасибо большое.
До свидания, спасибо.
До свидания, спасибо.